Right. Yes, it's.
Yeah.
Okay. Sandra, over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. You may as well just go to the next slide. I've only got one slide and skip that one. Okay. So, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I want to thank the speakers for letting me go first today. What I've written is more of a discussion paper, and it doesn't address governance really empirically in the same way that it will for the other papers. So I'm going to go first and try and address governance in more conceptual and normative terms. It seems like a better fit as a starting paper. So what I want to do is this very short talk, and I realize it will be short. I think we're aiming to speak for about 10 minutes each for the benefit of engaging with yourselves at a later point. So I'm going to do the impossible, and for an academic can actually speak less than the time I've been allocated. So what I want to do in the sociological tradition of making the mundane exceptional and the ordinary strange is to try to deconstruct the term governance through the availability of theory. And my reasons for doing this are conceptual, but also normative. So on the one hand, I want to show how governance can be differently understood from the perspective of specific epistemological positions and theoretical traditions. But on the other hand, I want to use theory to disrupt the kinds of ordinary, globally circulating ideas that have come to represent and stand in for governance, and in the process use theory to rethink and reimagine the discursive boundaries that work to define it. So in this way, I want to resist the wider tendency in some policy and education literature to use governance indiscriminately. That is, using governance as some kind of catch-all term for describing lots of complicated social, political, and economic processes. And as we know, it's clear, for example, how governance and related terms like good governance, effective governance, and governance failure have acquired a very specific meaning, both at the national level among governance and at the international level among organizations like the OECD and the World Bank. In these contexts, governance is often used to describe strategies that work to enhance the quality and standards of schools, usually with a focus on management control tools and systems such as risk assessment, target setting, performance appraisal, professional guidelines, and compliance checks. So these are rationalities and technologies are principally designed to improve transparency and accountability, but more specifically to render schools into calculable and comparable forms so that they are amenable to scrutiny and control. So the danger here, of course, is that we can overestimate the rationality and coherence of governance as a political program. And I think a lot of people do this sometimes when we talk about governance. So in other words, we think governance is everywhere the same, or that we can comfortably reduce some realities to expressions and functions of governance, as if governance is uncontested. So like neoliberalism, I would argue some education researchers mobilize the term governance as some kind of meta-narrative to describe the informal and informal means by which authorities try to secure power over something or someone, usually for the purpose of improving efficiency, affecting behavior change, or enhancing accountability. This indiscriminate use, and I would argue it's indiscriminate, means that, like neoliberalism, governance risks becoming just another empty signifier for articulating and condensing some very complicated processes. So education research consistently shows that governance tends to be restricted, rebutted, or revised to accommodate specific path dependencies, regulatory systems, and value systems. Governance, in other words, is a geopolitical construct. It's the unique product of national and subnational politics and projects. So for the sake of brevity, keeping to my time slot, I'm not going to explain the genealogy of the concept of governance, although suffice to say, its emergence can be considered a response to the new spatial and ontological arrangements made possible by globalization, namely a political strategy for coping with the diversity and complexity flowing from those processes. So we know that globalization introduced a new networked logic of flows, for example, was characterized by spontaneous self-organization, sometimes called heterarchy, the opposite of hierarchy. So the shift from government to governance describes the emergence of flexible modes of governing defined by plural and dispersed forms of power. Now, I want to very briefly use theory to show how governance can be reimagined for the purpose of achieving different political and economic ends. Now, there are clear overlaps in the development of approaches I'm going to describe, namely that they're broadly post-positivist and post-structuralist. That is to say, unlike positivism, they are not concerned with fixing and enforcing meanings about the nature of social reality. They are not normative prescriptions for governance. So a popular view of governance among some academics and policymakers, for example, is that decentralized welfare planning through public-private partnerships is innovative and democratic since it undermines vertical relations of power. But such a utopian view of governance is not shared by everyone. And against this somewhat postmodern reading of governance as self-referential, reflexive, and plural, Davies adopts a Gramscian approach to show how governance develops through the persistence rather than the erasure of vertical relations of power. Similarly, Pierre and Guy Peters adopt a state-centric approach to conceptualize governance as a reconfiguration of state power rather than an expression of its retreat or subordination. Pierre and Guy Peters acknowledge the degree to which the state under globalization disperses power outwards and downwards towards institutions and agents as a condition for self-governance. However, like Davies, they highlight the continuing importance of the state to governance within modern societies, namely the extent to which the state functions to regulate the interactions between systems and institutions. In contrast to this, Guman employs a deliberative interactive approach that stresses the spontaneous and self-organizing capacity of networks or partnerships, which he sees as mutual interactive learning environments. So from this perspective, sometimes called a cybernetic or a systems-based theory of governance, Guman moves beyond any exclusive focus on the state to demonstrate the enabling effects of communicated reasoning as the normative basis for governance. So in this sense, according to Guman, we're all little Habermasians collectively working together to solve problems. For Bevere and Rhodes, governance cannot be understood exclusively from a systems theory or institutionalist perspective because institutional relations and logics function only as proxies and aggregate concepts for the interplay of meanings among social actors. So like Guman, they emphasize the relational constitution of governance through social interaction. However, Bevere and Rhodes refute the idea that governance can be reduced to a communicated model of action that presumes all actors work or must be trained to work from a standard rationality or some ideal of perfect knowledge. Guman, for example, often appears to overestimate the capacity of social actors to translate their interests into pragmatic forms of social action that are agreeable and acceptable to all. Finally, Miller and Rhodes adopt a governmentality approach. This helps us to rethink governance as rationalities and strategies for producing particular kinds of subjects as modes of power for administering, managing, and intervening upon the behavior of others. So this is similar to a state-centric approach in that it emphasizes the fundamental importance of power and politics to governance, especially the role of political rationalities and bureaucracies to the formalization of experts, of expert knowledge, and the specification of problems and their solutions. So to conclude, what I've attempted to do is deconstruct governance from the vantage point of these different theoretical positions in order to make explicit its polyvalence as a contested concept and emergent and situated practice. So in doing so, I've tried to present a multi-dimensional perspective that I hope challenges the prevalence of functionalist accounts of governance and the epistemological basis for those accounts. So from a functionalist perspective, governance is a space of rationalist planning aimed at calculation and management of choices and costs in ways that predict and optimize efficiency and effectiveness. This is the most prevalent concept of governance you're likely to see in most government reports and international reports. So this includes the application of a universal standard rationality against which governance failure can be measured, evaluated, or improved to meet agreed policy solutions. So by deconstructing governance, I think it's possible to challenge the dominance of dysfunctionalism as the default expression for frames and meanings of governance. This includes using theory to highlight the possibility of engaging in different kinds of analytical and political work, including the study of governance-politics relationships and the role of governance in the cultivation of particular forms. This also means moving beyond an evaluative or functionalist concern with producing strategic knowledge in the service of governance, and instead asking critical questions about the role of power and knowledge to governance, namely the ways in which power and claims to knowledge are inscribed in models of governance, good governance, or effective governance. And then lastly, this is important to what I'd like to call critical studies of governance, given the tendency within some education research to assume, which a lot of people do, the rationality and coherence of governance as a political program. I'll finish now.
Very much, Andrew. Move on to the next speaker. We can take questions at the end, or we could put them in the chat if you like that. Yeah.
Maybe we could, when there's a PowerPoint, the bottom. Yeah, maybe.
Yes.
No. There's no sharing the screen.
We are sharing this. Oh, I
Yes,
guess we
no.
have. Oh, sorry.
No. So you have to go back to Zoom and now.
Let us close it off.
Show a Windows
It's been
10
days, right?
Yes, that's it. It must be right.
So this one. Okay, hi everyone. We are there or we are not there?
No, we should be there. Do you hear us? Yes, we're all here, aren't we? Aren't we? Are you all there?
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
Right.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. So we'll do it again.
Good. Well, hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me. It's a big pleasure to be here today, Andy, with Anna, with Emiliano, and the rest of the people who came in 3D to be here. Taking advantage of the splendid dissertation Andy did just before, I'm going to take the last part of his presentation about this idea of the critical studies of governance, and I'm going to share a small exploratory research we did in Catalonia about the effects of the fiscal cuts that we're trying to politicize this phenomenon that it tends to be like a mental condition called learned helplessness, and we try to apply this kind of critical studies of governance. Actually, they have just three simple ideas. The first one is that the education policy matters, and what the governments do can impact in people, also for subjects. The second one is that how people feel, it could be seen like a policy technology, so it can be political, and we can understand it from this perspective. And maybe governments can use, institution can use, etc. And the third one is related to one of the parts of the title of our symposium, is about this idea of resistance. That we take this idea that it has been said before for sure, that sometimes when, in this case, teachers are active responsibly, when probably they were taking care of one each other, you know. So these are the three simple ideas that I would like to share with you related to this small piece of research. The first one is that just to be aware that during the years of economic crisis and through what Stephen describes as the ratchet effect, this idea of incremental step-by-step, the education cut and the everyday effects in the schools in many respects produce what psychology calls about learned helplessness. What does it mean? It's this idea that when people lose control about the effects of their actions, of their lives, etc., this kind of exposure to this kind of reality can make people with less motivation, have more cognitive negative cognitive settings, and can affect affective disturbances. So we started this small research in the summer of 2020, after 6 months of lockdown. And when we saw that all that kind of feelings emerge radically and dramatically emerge from a lot of people in education, head teachers, etc. Everybody feel like with no motivations, with affective disturbances, etc. And that was our point of depart of exploratory research. That was our research question. So instead of taking education policy as something central, and instead of taking something like learned helplessness,
Were you able to hear us before? Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you. Let's share the screen again for the third time. There. Thank you. Thank you. And so learned helplessness here is not understood as a clinical condition, as an individual personal situation, but a disciplinary technology that can transform education leaders' identity, practices, affects, etc. So here we're taking the last part of Andrew's speech about these critical studies of governance. We use as well this positive and productive vision of power, where Foucault tried to say something that for me has been really interesting to use, that is that in education and social sciences in general, we used to tend to think about power like something dark that restricts us and limits us and all that stuff, but knowing to say that power is something that produces reality. So this idea has been really interesting. So learned helplessness is not only related to the bad condition, bad effects, etc., but it's related to that they are producing some kind of identity, some kind of practices, some kind of relationships. Let me show some of the quotes of the 4 head teachers we interviewed that probably speaks better than me about how they feel. You know, this idea that they gave us a group of children, of students, without teacher assigned. So they were to this point. So here you have 25 students, but there is no other teacher to teach them. And where are the teachers? I asked to the Department of Education. They aren't any. They aren't any, and they won't be. So this idea of you lose control. So you receive something like a group of students, but you have no teacher, and you have no the capacity to reach to share one. You know. So we had to start doing wonders. Well, the best we could. people were doing far above their ratio of class hours, etc. So we overcome this situation by doing more hours, more staying more at school, etc. And the second one is with the cats, people face work with less motivation. This idea about learn helplessness. This idea that if you know that you have a lot of work that you can do and that you'll do it a lower level of rigorous that you like, it's like what I am doing, what kind of sense it makes what I am doing here. So I think that you get lost in how you live it, how you feel it, and your emotions are frustration, rage, hopelessness. It was told, So it's interesting, this idea that kind of feelings are not only related to a personal and individual situation, it's related to what's happening in your world, so it's political, They haven't asked us about anything, this idea of you have no control, They arrive and there is this cat or the other cat or this new situation in your school, neither what we need, know the spaces. We don't know where the teacher have to ask. The feelings is one of the complete helplessness. This idea that we don't know how to keep moving, etc. There were people who went on sick leave. That's happened a lot, a lot of depression we were talking about before. Depressions, anxieties, burnout, all that stuff. We suffer burnout. That is, everyone experience it in their own way. This is interesting, this idea that everybody feels this like individuals, but actually it is not individual, it's something political, It's related to how people are governed, how people are they conduct, and those feelings, those affects are part of all this stuff, But there were people those who suffer most, it took a toll on their health in general, and of course, mental health, So that is another part of what's happening there. So the last idea is that in that kind of situation that governments produce through political economic cuts, cutting salaries, cutting resources, cutting bourses, cutting supports for the most vulnerable, etc., etc., etc. People tend to act sometimes responsibly, so following the rules, or irresponsibly to not following the rules in order to take care of people. Sometimes, in a positive sense, people generate care, solidarity, and support. This idea of the cushion. When this idea of the Stephen Enono. Although from the government's perspective, some of these forms of taking care can be seen as irresponsible, so resistance. So, as well as people said, there is always power in government, but it is also resistance. So it's interesting how happened. And from a political perspective of learning helplessness, this situation can be seen as non-docility, as resistance, and doing something in a different way. And this is the paper we published related to this. You can find it in this Open Access Education Policy Analysis Archives journal. And that's it. Thank you very much. And for any kind of thing here. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I'm just going to go next. Just give us 1 second to find. And
Show on screen or show on windows.
yes, you want.
Can go down.
That's
Here
right.
you are.
Thank you. We need to stop yours then.
Again, maybe you can close it one.
There's a chat. Yes, okay. This will be 3 days, isn't it?
Is the first one here on the left, the black one? Is it yours?
Yes.
Very good.
Okay, so let's start. Actually, I can do one small slide. Okay, well, my presentation today goes on Georgian Larger project, for which I employed a historical case study methodology to investigate the main national educational policy. And between aspects of state transformation and the identification of conflict during and after the period of structural reforms. So in this context, I examine the role of teacher trade unions in Greece in the contestation of reform, especially around policies of school and teacher evaluation. So picking up what Jordi was saying earlier on about resistance, I would focus on resistance here and talk about how they position themselves, how they see the relationship to the state, the dilemmas and the strategic reasoning, especially in the course of the post-2010 conflict over policies of teacher and school evaluation. I work with insights derived from Nikos Boulantzas to examine the reformation of state institutions that has occurred in the course of post-2010 conflict. And I will talk about his theory a bit later on. Before we move on, I'd like to give you a very quick and very sketchy outline of the context of the situation in Greece as with other European countries, especially in the south. Greece has been subjected to structural reforms, severe austerity, which was much more prolonged and much more severe than in other European countries. It has been described as a drastic, disturbing shock. Systemic reform, including education, was part of all the three memoranda of understanding, and teachers' evaluation, especially the reform which linked the evaluation of teachers' work with pay and promotion, created intense conflict, from in the context of teachers and teachers' unions and so on. There has been a short interlude. I call it an interlude during the period of the Syriza-led governments, which froze earlier reform. We see a reduction of conflict, a continuation of austerity, though, the third structural adjustment program, but in the end, as kind of consensual cultural evaluation, which was never implemented in schools, partly because the results of the 2019 general elections brought the centre-right government in power. Post-2019, we see the very fashion state emerging, equipped with digitalization, see acceleration of educational reform and a return to earlier programs of school autonomy and accountability, new relationships with between the state and key actors like unions. The lockdown and the pandemic created the conditions for, to some extent, for the acceleration of reform and a new wave of conflict between the government and the union. There are, of course, new elections coming up with unknown results, and Greece in 2021 at least was one of the poorest societies in Europe. So in this context, I'd like to introduce Boulantzas' work. Well, he was actively involved in the intellectual and political life in France and Greece in the 60s and 70s, a period which included both the upheaval of 1968 and the overthrow of the Greek dictatorship. Now, at the center of his work was an interest in the domain of the political, initially an attempt to develop an autonomous Marxist science of politics. Later, the focus shifted towards a theorization of the state as the institutional compensation of a changing balance of social forces. In the process, he added to his Western Marxist engagement with Gramsci, Sartre, and Husserl, an increasing sense of the relevance of Foucault's work on power and strategy. Wilkins engaged with Foucaultian ideas, especially around disciplinary techniques, but he never lost a focus on the state. Thinking about the political entailed thinking about the state. So his key theoretical contribution came in the 70s, and I'll summarize what I'm taking from it. He saw power not as a principle of explanation external to specific social relations, but as a relational phenomenon that itself needs explanation. He developed the argument that state power is a social relation reproduced through the continuous and conflictual interplay between institutional forms, the church, the schools, and so on, and the changing nature of social and political forces in a society. So within this perspective, power is treated as the capacity to realize class interests in a specific conjuncture, moment, and such interests are changeable, they depend on a range of visible class objectives. But it's very important to stress here that class interests do not derive in a priori fashion from the position of class agents in relation to production. He did argue emphatically in his later work, State, Power and Socialism, that there are no social classes prior to their opposition and struggle. So power is always correlated with resistance, but as with Foucault, power should not be understood as something wielded by the state, but it should instead studied in terms of the changing balance of forces mobilized behind specific strategies in various political conjunctions. As for the state itself, it should be recognized as a strategic domain, a field where competing strategies for hegemony encounter each other. So, to put it differently, the institutions of the state, its relation to social actors, its strategic direction, its capacity to bring about change, are all influenced by social conflict. A state historical and formal constitution is the result of such interplay, a material condensation of conflicts. State forms are always unstable, are always in flux, and as an effect of the political struggles that occur within it and around it, new social movements, for example, the state may have a fractured, disunified character, which dominant parties and interests strive to make more coherent. From a Polanyian perspective, one would argue, new public management or the rise of the evaluative state are interventions in social and political conflicts that are both enabled and enabling. They're enabled by shifts in relationships of power between social classes. They are enabling in that they consolidate these developments, disorganizing potentially adversarial social forces, to use your Hall's expression here, and setting up new institutional forms which change relationships within the state. For example, they advantage managerial actors as against other interests. So it is in the context of this theoretical perspective that my sets sought to understand the political and historical dimension of conflicts over policy of evaluation in Greece. What I would like to do next is to show a few examples, very few examples of episodes of political conflicts and union responses strategies. For this part of my research, I relied on data from narrative interviews with key trade union representatives who post 2008 have held significant posts in the two unions which represent state school teachers. I analyzed the dilemmas they faced them, as well as the strategic reasoning in responding to the evaluation policies of the post-19 broadly center-right government. So, the unions have recognized, they've seen the weakening of their privileged position in the state, and from their perspectives, they have been treated as adversarial social actors. They recognize that, especially post-2019, teacher evaluation reform emerged as a consolidating force of new and less balanced relations between teachers and government. I mean, you can see in the quote what they stress. We invited several times the ministry to engage in a dialogue with the unions, but the pandemic and the lockdown were used as excuses. Amendments to an educational act could pass through Parliament at 12 p.m. on a Friday evening, one after the other. There was no time for us to breathe. So against the reformation of the state, the narratives of interviewees returned emphatically to positions that they held in an earlier state formation. They say, are trying to make the government, are trying to make the case that the unions are against evaluation. This is not true. We are against the specific form of evaluation of the present government to which the unions object, the bureaucratic exercise removed from pedagogy and with a punitive character. They do return to earlier positions where they defined evaluation in pedagogical terms, something that we can see in other contexts in other countries. And from that, they maintain that their priority is now to protect the public cycle of education. Their agenda has switched to defensive action, trying to defend whatever they can. Now, in terms of strategy, though, what we see is that the terms of response are discussed with less certainty. If the state is treated as a domain of competing strategies for hegemony, then perhaps we should understand the unions as hesitant competitors. They're looking, some of them, to some extent, for renewal, to use Carter Stevenson and Pass's work there, which involves a process of self-reflection. Some interviews indeed reflected on the possibilities for inserting the unions in the reconfiguration of the state, looking back at previous policy, arguing that perhaps they should have embraced more openly an earlier framework of evaluation. Searching for new discourses to counter state reformation, the OECD, whose involvement, especially in the last structural reform, structural adjustment program, was particularly significant for education, was recognized again with some uncertainty as a necessary policy actor. The unions never met with the OECD despite repeated invitations by the 2019 government to meet with the OECD team. But in retrospect, reflecting back, and thinking about strategy post-19, they are arguing that perhaps we should have met with the OECD, perhaps we could have got something out of the meeting with them. Others, however, emphasize the risks of engaging with policies which aim to dissolve what they see as a necessary cause, political or social, grounded in popular experience. For a particular fraction of the union, Syriza produced the concept of the good evaluation, did not make it distinct from previous programs. And in this context, one interviewee said, I often ask my union colleagues, have you realized what you have done? Reluctantly agreeing to this framework. We left the tracks for the train to run. The new democracy, the center-right party in government now, will arrive and it will just press the button. So, some concluding thoughts. I explored a period of state reformation and also a period of strategic crisis for the unions in my research. But in a period of intersecting crisis, financial, socio-medical, climate disaster, deepening erosion of democracy, I want to suggest that there remains an important place for the state, understood as both a strategic domain and a permeable site of conflict between social actors. And perhaps in the face of recent and future mobilizations by teachers and lecturers, these are important questions to ask about how to understand these struggles and perhaps how to transform them into effective strategy. Yes, you can.
Just can I go?
Are you trying to?
You playing the
Yes, just to how can I go back and forth with the slides? Because
Just,
clear.
there you go. So that's that. Just push that to go to the next one, okay?
Okay, thank you.
This,
very
yeah,
much.
this one.
Yeah, this one. Okay, thanks. So, okay, sorry for technical problems and good evening and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you again to Andrew and Dana for this kind of invitation and good job for joining this symposium today. Today, I would like to mobilize basically an archaeological perspective, an archaeological perspective, in order to discuss some continuities and discontinuities in the episteme or in the epistemic space of educational governance, or what I would call digital educational governance with brackets, with digital within the brackets. I will explain a little bit about that more later on. And I want to undergo through this task, assuming that we are living a time when we are, to a certain extent, we can observe an intensification, a sort of repetition, an intensification of established mode of educational governance, which are basically data-based and data-driven forms of management on one side, within a sort of teleological frame, which is articulated around and governed by the promise of perfection. And at the same time, we are assisting to an increasing process of differentiation with this kind of repetition. Differentiation that is somehow related to the entering of digital technologies within the backdrop of establishment of educational governance. And this is overall my framework. This is part of an ongoing research project. I'm quite at the starting point. What I will present today can be considered as something which is comprehensive or exhaustive to a certain extent. How could it be, given the topic? But more or less the starting point. I hope I will be able to go further in the analysis in the next months or years. But I would like to spend some words on the why of this research project. Basically, I understand this kind of work as a sort of practical exercise of critique. Whose aim is not to present a portrayal of reality, but basically to contribute to a large possibility for analysis and crossing over, which is among in short words, for public thinking and public action in individual education. And what I'm looking at and thinking about are especially professional educators, teachers, and people who work in schools and universities. Basically, mine is an attempt to make the present of education governance open and revisable through problematization. What I shared with the colleagues in the symposium today essentially is an understanding governance as an ensemble of hegemonic projects that are also site of struggle in a play between difference and repetition. I take this metaphor from Gilles Deleuze. And if I recognize that the contingency of education governance as self-transmuting and hegemonic projects that basically emerge on the surface of history from the gathering together of different political rationalities, technologies of power and ethics subjectivities. At the same time, I recognize and share with Andrew and Olmedo, with Wilkins and Olmedo, the idea that there is across scales, sides, and times, there is the persistence of some unwarranted assertion in sciences across dominant paradigms of education governance. This will be my focus today. I share with Coulson, Seller, and Taylor Webb the idea that we are assisting to an intensification of previous political rationalities, technologies, and ethics of education governance, but at the same time, the emergence of a significant difference within this epistemic and technological field. And I do this with Nicholas Rose, according to an archaeological sensibility, thinking that governance is a discursive practice. A discursive practice basically involves the mobilization of a gaze upon action and of specific, particular kind of horizons of intelligibility and morality. And in thinking about digital education governance, digitalization and digital technologies as part of my problem in this research today, I want to be clear that I'm thinking of digitalization as a process which is not creating a different layer of governance. Digital education governance is not something different from education governance and established mode of education governance. But basically, I look at these processes as the entering of digital technologies and digital cultures and digital languages, digital rationalities within the backdrop of conventional policy instruments and techniques of governance and government in the field of education. And this, of course, involves a reshaping of the ways in which educational realities are seen, known, made amenable to interventions, and acted upon, and this is my problem. Of course, these are just few examples of digital education governance practices, where we see that the mobilization of digital technologies in attempting to govern education using, for instance, predictive analytics or monitoring software or guidance softwares or software and platforms to empower processes of accountability or processes of personalization and customization through artificial intelligence or machine learning based solution and so on. But of course, this is a very brief sketch. The list will be very long. What kind of question coming to my archaeological perspective I'm mobilizing in this research? Basically, in order to explore the processes of transmutation across practices of educational governance at the epistemic level, what I'm asking is what is changing in the production of subject and objects across space and time to processes of spatialization and temporalization, how specific governing subjects and objects are recognized and treated, what authorities are assigned to hold and care for them, and sometimes they can decide about them, and according to what criteria, what rationality, the methods that are employed to make distinct type of operation on, with, and through them. Basically, the ontological politics and the epistemological politics of digital education governance. And this is so far the epistemic terrain that I've been able to map. Again, this is a starting point, and I'm trying to discuss this with you today. When we come to the ontological politics, the processes of production of the objects, subjects, and their relation in the field of educational governance, my feeling is that we can recognize a tension between two epistemic figures, two grids of specification that brings to life a specific kind of educational reality. And they are systems on one side and topologies on the other. When I talk about system, basically I'm thinking it's an epistemic figure that bring to reality and to life an educational reality that is made of bounded volumes, made of units and subunits that are related to horizontally and hierarchically at the same time through relations of communication that bring to existence multi-layered domains made of, elements, entities that are in a relation of causation, dependence, which are positioned in a relation of exteriority and adaptation or adaptiveness with an external environment, which is an uncertain environment, and which are functionalized to a group, within a group. And interestingly, systems can assume different shapes, because we can have living systems through organic analogies, or cybernetic or network-like systems. There is a persistence of this kind of extent figure. At the same time, I think it is important to recognize the increased influence of an imagined topological configuration of the subjects and objects and the fields of education governance, where entities are thought of as heterogeneous, as radically different, as always in state of perennial becoming, change. And these processes of change, almost deformation, of the subjects and objects of education governance, develop across the proliferation of different surfaces. And on these surfaces, there are different processes of association between these entities that transmute, that they form them at the same time. And again, here there is a really interesting work from Caleb Woods, Sam Seller, and Taylor Webb, when they recalling Deleuze, think about the increasing significance of topological thinking in the space of education, the epistemic space of education governance, highlighting how, in this case, there is a reconfiguration of the populations of education governance, where collectives are basically rethought as markets, samples, data, banks, and the like, and individuals are rethought as individuals, as coded matter of government, coded matter of control. And these two figures, in tension among them, are intermittently related to two kinds of temporalities. So the other side of the ontological politics I'm trying to describe today. A time which is a linear one, an evolutive one, a cumulative one, which is an evolutionary one, which is, this is a temporality which is strictly linked to the modernist need of the perfect knowledge for the perfect government, and at the same time, and this on one hand, and this is a time which is also based on the fate in the human capacity to know and control social reality, and a very different kind of temporalization, where the movement of the entities of education governance in space is thought not as linear, but as circular, iterative. This is a time made of feedback loops which come one after the other. And this is a time where the norm is not anymore a sort of evolutionary stability, or a stability in evolution, but change and fluidity become the norm of the entities. And these two forms of spatialization and temporalization also interact with different kinds of epistemologies. One of the striking continuities, in the transition between education governance and digital education governance is the repetition of the process of datafication, repetition of a kind of data-driven rationality. And of course, we continue to assist to a process through which the translation of subjects and entities into quantitative data creates the condition for the mobilization of evaluation as a biopolitical mode of governance. At the same time, the acceleration in the iterative and cumulative production of data, which is related to the morality of the feedback loop, also is making possible the emergence of new modes of knowing the equation of reality, which here I try to label in terms of anticipation, prediction, and model. Basically, the shift here is a shift from a mode of knowing the equation of reality in which through evaluation one attempt to know the condition of the present through the retrieval of past data, to a different kind of mode of knowing in which basically the objective is to change the condition of present through the recognition of patterns of change, again, in data variation, in real-time data variations. And this also is parallel with another tension in the field of the epistemology. Sorry. Another tension where, if governance continues to be established as the attempt to struggle against the uncertainty and instability of the environment, of the space, to a certain extent, there is a shift and a tension between two kinds of governance rationalities. One, which is a humanist rationality, where there is an emphasis on ideas like decision making, deliberation, rational choice, and so on, a reflexive and evidence-driven forms of governance, and automation with an emerging rationality, where the computational capacity to work through data and know reality through data are basically understood as the main and most reliable way to preempt agency, to preempt spontaneity, and to secure unstable futures. Basically, the future becomes the object of governance. Now, just a very final point, very short one. As I said at the beginning, this is so far my exercise in mapping. As I said, this is an exercise of practical critique, a sort of fictionalization, of the digital education governance and this kind of space. Was aims not to portray reality, but again, make an intervention in the game of truth in order to enlarge the possibilities of crossing over to an attempt to promote a performative politics or description of the present of education governance. And in doing so, I want to be clear that I'm not carrying on this research within a frame of a nostalgically humanist framework. My idea is to try to context the anthropological postulate of governance and try to context also its biopolitical correlates. But at the same time, I think we need to adopt a limit attitude, a sort of politics of becoming that refuse any disappearance of the human. The idea is to promote a sort of politics of becoming in education governance that invites us to experiment with human and machine assemblages that discard any kind of Promethean and evolutionary politics of the subject, but also its disappearance. Thank you very much.